Welcome to History for Sleep. We are traveling back in time to the 4th century BC. We are in the sun-drenched lands of ancient Greece, surrounded by the murmur of marketplaces and the echoes of philosophy, to witness a life unlike any other. What does it truly mean to be free? Is it the right to cast a vote in the assembly, the ability to accumulate wealth and own property, the power to climb the ladder of society? In the ancient world, and especially in the sun-drenched cities of ancient Greece, these were the accepted markers of a successful life, the very cornerstones of civilization. This was a world of brilliant, profound contradictions, a place where revolutionary ideas about democracy, logic, and justice grew and flourished, yet existed alongside the rigid hierarchies of social status and the unquestioned institution of slavery. It was a society meticulously built on rules, on nomos, the complex web of laws, customs, and traditions that dictated every aspect of existence. How one should live, what gods one must honor, and whom one was required to respect. To be a good citizen was to seamlessly follow these rules. To be a great man was to master them and use them to your advantage. The cities themselves, carved from marble and stone, hummed with the ceaseless energy of ambition. Men sought fortunes in the bustling, chaotic marketplaces. They pursued immortal glory on the battlefield, and they chased elusive wisdom in the shaded groves of the academies. They adorned themselves in fine robes, signaling their status to the world. They attended elaborate banquets where politics and philosophy mingled with wine. They built magnificent, awe-inspiring temples to appease a pantheon of powerful and often fickle gods. At the core of it all was a belief in order, in propriety, in the immense importance of one's public reputation. Shame was a currency as powerful as gold, a social weapon used to keep everyone in their designated place. The fear of public ridicule, of being seen as strange, improper, or foolish, was a cage whose bars were invisible but stronger than any iron. Life for the civilized Greek was a grand and demanding performance, and everyone, from the highest aristocrat to the humblest craftsman, knew their part. But into this well-ordered world, this great stage of civilization, a strange story began to spread. It started as a dismissive whisper in the marketplaces of Athens, a curious rumor passed between merchants, and then it grew into a powerful legend, a tale told and retold in every corner of the Hellenic world. It was the story of a man who looked upon the grand performance, studied all the actors, and with a wry smile decided not to play. A man who saw the intricate laws, the sacred traditions, the relentless pursuit of wealth and fame, and had the audacity to call them all a sham, a distraction from the real business of living. He was not a king who commanded from a throne, not a general who led phalanxes into battle, and not a wealthy statesman whose words swayed the assembly. In fact, by the standards of his world, he possessed absolutely nothing. He owned no home, sought no office, and commanded no one. And yet, the most powerful men of his age, including the conqueror of the known world, would come to seek him out, drawn by an authority that came from no earthly power. This man chose to live as a stray dog lives, finding shelter in a large ceramic jar, a pithos, discarded on a street corner. He ate whatever he could find, sometimes begging from passers-by with a sharp wit, other times foraging for wild plants. He walked barefoot through the scorching heat of summer and the biting frost of winter, his body a testament to his indifference to comfort. In a society obsessed with dignity and appearances, he performed the most private of bodily functions in the middle of the public square, not out of madness, but as a deliberate philosophical lesson. He relentlessly challenged the most learned thinkers of his day. He openly mocked the most powerful politicians, and he utterly baffled the common people who watched his daily spectacle. When others desperately sought comfort, he embraced hardship as a form of training. When others craved praise and honor, he seemed to welcome insults, often twisting them into badges of honor with a brilliant, disarming logic. He carried no sword or spear, but his words were sharper and more piercing than any weapon. He wrote no books, leaving behind no grand treatises. but his own life became a living text, a radical manuscript that philosophers would study and debate for millennia. He was a walking, breathing paradox, a beggar who seemed to possess a richness that kings could not buy, a homeless exile who was more at home in the world than any citizen, a man who was called the dog, yet spent his entire life in the relentless public search for a single true human being. What was he? A simple madman, a fool whose mind had been broken by some great personal tragedy in his past? Or was he something else entirely, something far more dangerous to the established order? Was he, perhaps, the only truly sane man in a world that was drunk on its own illusions of status and wealth? Was his shocking theatrical lifestyle a desperate cry for attention from a forgotten outcast, or was it a carefully crafted philosophical statement, a profound and daring experiment in the outer limits of human freedom? This is the story of that man. A man who stripped his life down to the barest of essentials in order to discover what was truly important. A man who dared to ask the most uncomfortable questions, not with ink on parchment, but with the unwavering commitment of his very existence. That man's story begins not in the marbled porticos and famous academies of Athens, but far from it, on the very edge of the Hellenic world. It starts in a place where the familiar comforts of Greek civilization met the vast, untamed wilderness of foreign lands. His name was Diogenes, and he was born around the year 412 BC in the city of Sinope. Sinope was an outpost, a bustling, thriving port city perched on the southern coast of the Euxine Sea, the body of water we now call the Black Sea. Unlike the great heartland cities of Athens or Sparta, it was not a center of established tradition and pure Hellenic identity. For a Greek living in Athens, this was the frontier. It was a place of immense opportunity, but also of constant cultural collision. Founded centuries earlier by colonists from the great city of Miletus, Sinope had grown into a powerful and wealthy hub. Its natural harbor was one of the finest on the sea, a safe haven for ships braving the notoriously treacherous waters. The city itself was nestled on a peninsula, a finger of land pointing northward, protected by formidable walls and a watchful citadel. Behind the city, the landscape was rich and rugged. The mountains of Paphlagonia were covered in dense forests, providing an endless supply of valuable timber, a resource that was becoming scarce in mainland Greece. This timber was one of the cornerstones of Sinope's wealth, eagerly purchased by merchants to build the ships that fueled the engine of trade. The waters teemed with life. The sea around Sinope was legendary for its fishing, especially its vast shoals of tuna, which the locals called dolphins. These fish were caught, salted, and exported across the known world, becoming a staple food in many Greek cities. The land was fertile, producing grain and fine olive oil. Sinope was a city of abundance, a place of pragmatic, hard-headed commerce. Here, a man's worth was often measured not by the purity of his ideas or the nobility of his lineage, but by the weight of the silver in his purse and the success of his latest trading venture. This constant focus on trade and profit created a unique atmosphere. Sinope was a true melting pot. On its crowded streets, one could hear a dozen different languages. Greek colonists, with their traditions and gods, rubbed shoulders with the native Paphlagonian people from the mountainous interior. Scythian horsemen from the vast northern steppes, with their distinctive clothing and guttural tongue, came to trade furs and grain. There were traders from Thrace, from Persia, from the far-flung shores of the sea. It was a city where you learned to judge a person not by their accent or the cut of their clothes, but by their ability to strike a bargain. This environment would have been the first and most important teacher for a young Diogenes. He grew up surrounded not by abstract philosophical debate, but by the raw, unfiltered realities of life. He saw how fortunes were made and lost overnight. He saw how men from different cultures, with different beliefs, could find common ground when money was involved. He witnessed the desperation of sailors and the arrogance of wealthy merchants. He understood from a very early age that the neat and tidy rules discussed in Athenian schools often fell apart in the face of human necessity and greed. Life in Sinope was less refined, perhaps, but it was also more honest. It was a city too busy making a living to wrap itself in the elaborate social rituals of the older Greek states. Status was important, but it was a fluid, dynamic thing, constantly being negotiated in the marketplace. This lack of rigidity, this constant exposure to different ways of life, would have planted a seed in the young boy's mind. The idea that the way his own people did things was not the only way, and perhaps not even the best way. He would have played on the docks, watching the great timber-laden ships set sail for distant ports. He would have smelled the salt in the air, the pungent aroma of drying fish, and the scent of foreign spices. He would have learned about the world not from maps and scrolls, but from the stories of sailors, men with weathered faces who spoke of strange lands and stranger customs. This was his education, an education in the practical, the real, the diverse. It taught him that the world was much larger and much messier than most philosophers were willing to admit. It was the perfect breeding ground for a mind that would later refuse to accept any single, narrow definition of what it means to be human. In this dynamic, multicultural world of Sinope, the traditional pillars of Greek society held a different kind of weight. In Athens, a citizen's identity was tied to his family's history, his participation in religious festivals, and his service to the state. In Sparta, it was tied to his discipline and military prowess. But in Sinope, the great equalizer, the force that often mattered more than gods or lineage, was money. Commerce was the city's lifeblood, and its values permeated every aspect of daily life. The clinking of silver and bronze coins was the city's true anthem. The marketplace, or agora, was not just a center for trade. It was the heart of Sinope's social and political universe. Here, contracts were made, partnerships were forged, and reputations were built not on philosophical arguments, but on one's reliability as a business partner. The people of Sinope were known for their shrewdness. They were pragmatists, skilled negotiators who understood that value was a fluid concept. A shipment of grain was worth one price in the morning and another by evening, depending on the arrival of new ships or the latest rumors from across the sea. This constant fluctuation, this idea that worth was not fixed but was instead a matter of circumstance and perception, would have been a profound lesson for a developing mind. Nothing was absolute. Everything was negotiable. Central to the city's pride and economic power was its mint. Sinope was one of the cities in the Greek world that had the authority to produce its own currency. The coins of Sinope, often stamped with the head of an eagle or a nymph, were a symbol of its independence and a guarantee of its commercial influence. They were trusted in ports all across the Black Sea and the Aegean. To work at the mint was to be at the very heart of the city's power. It was a position of immense trust and responsibility, for the integrity of the city's currency was the foundation of its prosperity. And it was here, within the walls of this critical institution, that the next chapter of Diogenes' life would be violently shaped. Life in this bustling port also exposed its inhabitants to a constant parade of differing customs and beliefs. A Greek might find it abhorrent to eat horse meat, yet he would trade daily with a Scythian for whom it was a staple. A local might worship Apollo, while a trader from the East paid homage to gods the Greeks had never heard of. This daily exposure to contradictory truths would have chipped away at any notion of absolute cultural superiority. When you see that the sacred cow of one culture is the dinner of another, it becomes difficult to believe that your own traditions are infallible, divinely ordained truths. They are simply nomos, customs, habits. And customs, as any good trader in Sinope knew, could change. This environment fostered a particular kind of mindset, a cynical edge that is common in centers of international trade. The people of Sinope were worldly and perhaps a bit jaded. They had seen it all. They understood that behind grand pronouncements of piety and honor often lay the simple desire for profit. This practical, unvarnished view of human motivation would become a hallmark of Diogenes's later philosophy. He never trusted eloquent speeches about virtue. He trusted only actions. And in Sinope, he had a lifetime of education in watching what men did, rather than listening to what they said. Furthermore, life on the frontier was raw. While Sinope was a center of wealth, it was also a place of danger. The same sea that brought merchants also brought pirates. Piracy was a constant threat, and sometimes a lucrative business in its own right. The city's markets were not only filled with goods like timber and fish, but also with people. The slave trade was a brutal and accepted part of the ancient economy, and Sinope, as a major port, was a key transit point. Young Diogenes would have seen human beings bought and sold like cattle, another stark lesson in how easily a person's worth could be reduced to a monetary value. This gritty reality was a world away from the idealized discussions taking place in Plato's academy. There was no room for abstract theories of a perfect state when you were haggling over the price of salted fish or listening to news of a ship lost to pirates. This harsh pragmatism, this direct and often brutal engagement with the mechanics of survival and profit, created a foundation of realism in Diogenes. It inoculated him against the kind of idealistic philosophy that he would later come to despise. He came from a place where reality had sharp edges, and he never lost his preference for the tangible over the theoretical. He was a son of the frontier, a product of a city that was too busy, too diverse, and too pragmatic to be fooled by beautiful words. Within this city of sharp-edged reality, Diogenes was born into a life of privilege. He was not the son of a fisherman or a humble craftsman. His father was Askēsis, a man of considerable standing. The historical records are not perfectly clear on his exact title. Some call him a banker, others a money changer, still others the official in charge of the city's mint. But all these roles point to the same truth. Askēsis was a man who controlled the flow of money in Sinope. The family was wealthy, respected, and deeply embedded in the civic and economic life of the city. This fact is crucial, for it means that Diogenes's later embrace of extreme poverty was not the sour complaint of a man who never had anything. It was the deliberate, radical rejection of a man who once had everything. His youth would have been comfortable, mapped out for him according to the traditions of a prosperous Greek family. He would not have known hunger or want. He would have received the standard education for a boy of his class. This education was built on a dual foundation: gymnastique for the body and musique for the mind and spirit. He would have spent his afternoons in the gymnasium, training his body through running, wrestling, and throwing the discus and javelin, pursuits intended to create a strong, disciplined, and graceful citizen. His intellectual education would have revolved around the great works of Greek culture. He would have learned to read and write, to play the lyre, and to recite long passages from the epic poems of Homer. The stories of the Iliad and the Odyssey would have been his first lessons in morality, heroism, and the capricious nature of the gods. He would have studied the works of other poets and perhaps the early natural philosophers. His father's wealth would have ensured he had access to the best tutors Sinope could offer. He was being groomed for a life of success, to take over his father's business, to become a merchant, or perhaps to engage in the city's politics. He was on a path to becoming another pillar of Sinope's commercial society. Yet, one can imagine a restless and critical mind already stirring within the young boy. Growing up in a household where the primary concern was money, he would have seen its effects firsthand. He would have witnessed the anxiety that came with protecting wealth, the compromises made to acquire more of it, and the superficial respect it commanded. He would have listened to his father and his associates discuss profits, exchange rates, and the metallic content of coins. It's possible that this constant immersion in the world of finance bred in him not an appreciation for wealth, but a deep-seated contempt for it. He may have seen the whole enterprise as a game, a complex illusion that kept men chasing after stamped pieces of metal while their lives slipped away. The ancient world left us few reliable details about his early personality, but we can infer much from the man he became. It is unlikely that he was a quiet or obedient child. A mind as sharp and satirical as his usually shows its edges early. He was probably the boy who asked the uncomfortable question, who pointed out the emperor's new clothes, who saw the absurdity in the solemn rituals of adults. He may have clashed with his tutors, questioning the relevance of epic poems when there was raw, unfiltered life happening just outside his door in the city's port. He may have argued with his father, challenging the value of a life spent counting and guarding money. His education taught him about the heroic ideals of Achilles and Odysseus, yet the heroes he saw around him in Sinope were the ones who closed the most profitable deals. This chasm between the ideal and the real is often where a philosophical mind is born. He was taught to value honor, but he lived in a world that valued silver. He was taught about the gods, but he saw men who worshipped only profit. The pressure on his father, Askēsis, must have been immense. Overseeing a city's currency was a task fraught with peril. He was responsible for maintaining the trust that held Sinope's economy together. He had to guard against counterfeiters from the outside and temptation from within. The raw materials, the silver and bronze, had to be sourced, their purity assayed, and the coins struck with perfect consistency. Any hint of impropriety, any suggestion that the coins of Sinope were not what they seemed, could trigger a crisis of confidence that would ruin the city's trade. And in a world of fierce competition, there would have been constant pressure to cut corners, to perhaps debase the currency slightly to increase profits or to pay for civic expenses. The mint was a crucible, a place where a man's integrity was tested daily. It was in this high-stakes environment that the comfortable world of the young Diogenes was about to come crashing down. The fall came suddenly and catastrophically. The exact details are lost to the mists of history, obscured by rumor and conflicting accounts, but the core of the event is undisputed. Askēsis, the trusted guardian of Sinope's wealth, was accused of a crime that struck at the very heart of the city. He had defaced the currency. This was not a simple act of theft. To deface or adulterate the coinage, a crime known as perichoraxis in Greek, was an act of profound betrayal. It could mean several things. It might have been a crude form of counterfeiting. More likely, it was a subtler, more insidious crime. It could have involved shaving tiny slivers of precious metal from the edges of thousands of coins, accumulating a fortune from the stolen dust. Or it could have meant debasement, melting down the city's silver and mixing it with cheaper base metals like bronze or copper, then restriking the coins to look like the real thing, while pocketing the difference. Whatever the specific method, the result was the same. It was an attack on the trust that held the entire commercial network together. Every citizen, every foreign merchant who accepted a Sinopean coin did so on faith. Askēsis had shattered that faith. In the ancient Greek world, this was not seen as a financial misstep. It was a form of treason, a sacrilege against the city itself. The coins were not just tools of commerce. They were emblems of civic identity, bearing the symbols of the city's gods and heroes. To corrupt them was to corrupt the city's soul. The public outrage would have been immediate and fierce. Every person who held a Sinopean coin suddenly feared they had been cheated. Trade would have faltered. Suspicion would have replaced the easy trust of the marketplace. The scandal was a poison injected directly into the city's veins. The most critical question, the one that would define the rest of Diogenes' life, was about his own role in this disaster. Was he merely the innocent son of a disgraced father, caught in the wreckage? The historical accounts are deeply divided, presenting us with a compelling mystery. One version of the story claims that Askēsis alone was the culprit, and that Diogenes was simply found guilty by association, forced to flee along with his criminal father. But another, more provocative, and more enduring version of the tale places the young Diogenes at the very center of the crime. According to the ancient biographer Diogenes Laertius, It was Diogenes himself who took the fateful step. This account suggests that he journeyed to the oracle at Delphi, the most sacred site in the Greek world, to ask the god Apollo for guidance. The cryptic advice he received was to deface the currency. A pious man might have interpreted this as a metaphor, a call to challenge social norms or political conventions. But Diogenes, in this telling, took the advice with a shocking literalness. He returned to Sinope and began to systematically deface the city's coins. This version of the story is almost certainly a later invention, a clever attempt by philosophers to imbue his exile with a sense of philosophical destiny. It neatly frames his entire life as an act of obedience to a divine, if misunderstood, command. It transforms a sordid crime into his first act of public philosophy. The truth was likely far more mundane and far more human. Whether he was a direct participant or an unwilling accomplice, the consequences for Diogenes were absolute. The family's name was ruined. Their wealth was confiscated. Their status evaporated overnight. He, the privileged son, educated and set for a comfortable life, was now a pariah. He was branded a criminal, an outcast. Imagine the shame, the public humiliation. The friends who now avoided his gaze in the street, the whispers that followed him through the agora, the doors that were now closed to him. The entire world he had known, the world of respectability, wealth, and future prospects, had been utterly destroyed. There would be no recovery. The crime was too great, the betrayal too deep. The city of Sinope, his home, the only world he had ever known, cast him out. He was sentenced to exile, the most dreaded punishment for a Greek citizen after death. To be exiled was to be stripped of your identity, to become a non-person. It meant losing the protection of your city's laws and the company of your kin. It was a form of civic death. And so, the young man, Diogenes, with nothing but the clothes on his back and the bitter taste of disgrace in his mouth, was forced to leave Sinope, never to return. His old life was over. The path he had been walking had vanished from under his feet. Ahead of him lay only the unknown, a world in which he had no name, no home, and no future. He walked away from the city gates a broken man, but not in the way his condemners might have hoped. The journey of an exile was a brutal one. He was now a ghost, haunting the roads of the Greek world. Every city he entered would have been a fresh reminder of what he had lost. He saw citizens living under the protection of laws that no longer applied to him. He saw families gathered in homes, a comfort he would never know again. He saw men participating in the life of their community, a privilege that had been violently stripped from him. Loneliness was his constant companion, and the gnawing hunger in his belly was matched only by the emptiness of his new, hollowed-out identity. For a time, he must have been consumed by the loss. Bitterness, anger, and despair would have been natural responses. He had lost not just his wealth, but his very place in the world. He was adrift in a hostile sea. Most men in his position would have been crushed by the weight of such a fall. They might have spent the rest of their days trying to claw their way back to some semblance of respectability, or they might have simply withered away in poverty and obscurity. But somewhere on the dusty roads between Sinope and the heart of Greece, a profound transformation began to take place within Diogenes. He started to look at his situation not through the eyes of the society that had rejected him, but through his own. He examined his pain, his shame, and his loss, and he began to dissect them. What, exactly, had he lost? A house. It was just timber and stone, a trap that tied a man to one place. Money. It was just stamped metal, a source of constant anxiety and foolish pride. Reputation. It was merely the opinion of others, a fragile thing dependent on the whims of the crowd. He realized that in casting him out, the city of Sinope had not truly harmed him. They had, in fact, performed a strange and terrible kind of surgery. They had cut away everything that was superficial, everything that was non-essential. They had intended to punish him, but they had accidentally set him free. He was no longer bound by the need to maintain a reputation, to protect his wealth, or to conform to the expectations of his peers. The worst had already happened. He had nothing left to lose, and in that realization, he found an incredible, intoxicating power. He was liberated from the fear that governs the lives of most men. This internal shift gave birth to one of his most famous and defining statements. Years later, when another exile from Sinope saw him and taunted him, saying, "The people of Sinope have condemned you to wander," Diogenes simply replied, "and I have condemned them to stay." This was not just a clever retort. It was a declaration of independence. It was the moment he fully weaponized his disgrace. In that single sentence, he reversed the entire power dynamic. He was not the victim, they were. He was the free man, able to experience the entire world, while they remained prisoners, trapped within the walls of their city and the even more confining walls of their own narrow conventions. It was in this new state of mind that he revisited the oracle's prophecy. Whether he had actually gone to Delphi or had only heard the story, the phrase "deface the currency" now took on a new, electrifying meaning. The Greek word for currency, nomisma, came from the same root as the word for custom or law, nomos. Suddenly, he understood. The god's command was not about metal coins. It was a philosophical mission. His true purpose was not to tamper with the currency of Sinope, but to challenge, to question, to deface the political and social currency of all mankind. His job was to expose the false values, the hollow traditions, the counterfeit virtues that people accepted without a second thought. This reinterpretation was his salvation. It transformed his meaningless suffering into a noble calling. He was not just a wandering beggar. He was a soldier in a war against hypocrisy. His poverty was not a punishment. It was his uniform. His homelessness was not a curse. It was his vantage point, allowing him to observe society as an outsider, with a clarity that no citizen could ever possess. His shame became his shield. He had a purpose now, one far grander than being a wealthy banker in a provincial city. With this newfound mission burning in his mind, his aimless wandering gained a direction. All roads for a thinking man in the ancient world eventually led to one place: Athens. It was the intellectual capital of Greece, the city of Socrates, the home of Plato's academy. It was the place where ideas were debated with more passion than anywhere else on earth. Diogenes began to make his way there, but he was not coming as a humble student seeking wisdom. He was coming as an inspector, a critic, a physician who had diagnosed the sickness of civilization and was now arriving at the heart of the patient to deliver the shocking cure. He carried no possessions, but he brought with him a mind sharpened by loss and a radical new understanding of freedom. The boy from Sinope was dead. A new entity, Diogenes the Cynic, was about to be born in the streets of Athens. When Diogenes finally walked through the gates of Athens, he was stepping into the center of his world. This was not just another city. It was an idea made manifest in stone and marble. For centuries, Athens had been the undisputed cultural and intellectual heart of all Greece. Even after its devastating military defeat at the hands of Sparta in the Peloponnesian War, its reputation as the capital of thought remained undiminished. For a man with a new philosophical mission, there was no other place to be. He would have entered through the Dipylon Gate, the main entrance to the city, and walked down the wide Panathenaic Way, the very road used for the city's grand religious processions. The sights and sounds would have been overwhelming. The city was a living museum of artistic and architectural glory. Towering above everything on its rocky plateau was the Acropolis, crowned by the breathtaking form of the Parthenon, a temple to the city's patron goddess, Athena. Its marble columns, gleaming in the Attic sun, were a testament to the city's ambition, wealth, and its belief in its own divine favor. As he descended into the city proper, he would have found himself in the Agora, the sprawling marketplace that was the true hub of Athenian life. But this was more than a place of commerce. It was a chaotic, vibrant theater of civic engagement. Here, merchants hawked their wares next to philosophers gathering circles of young listeners. Statues of gods and heroes stood watching as politicians debated the latest issues of the day. He would have seen the Stoa Poikile, the famous painted colonnade, where men gathered to escape the sun and discuss everything from business to the nature of the cosmos. He would have seen the great temples, the law courts, and the council houses, all the machinery of a powerful and deeply self-confident democracy. But even more than the buildings, it was the atmosphere of words that defined Athens. The air itself seemed to be alive with argument, debate, poetry, and rhetoric. This was a city obsessed with language. And at the heart of its intellectual life was the immense lingering shadow of a man who had been executed some 30 years before Diogenes' arrival. Socrates. Though he was dead, his method and his questions had irrevocably changed the course of philosophy. Socrates had dragged philosophy down from the heavens and forced it to examine human life. What is justice? What is virtue? How should one live? These were the questions that now echoed in every philosophical school in Athens. Everyone was, in some way, responding to Socrates. The most famous of his followers, Plato, was now at the zenith of his power and influence. Not far from where Diogenes stood outside the city walls was the Academy, the school Plato had founded. This was not merely a place for lectures. It was a community of scholars and a training ground for the future statesmen and thinkers of Greece. Within the shaded groves of the Academy, Plato and his students engaged in rigorous dialectic, seeking to understand the ultimate reality that lay beyond the world of the senses. They spoke of a higher world of perfect, eternal forms, the ideal blueprints for everything that existed in the flawed material world. Theirs was a philosophy that aimed to elevate the soul, to turn it away from the messy realities of the body and the city, and towards the pure, unchanging light of abstract truth. Elsewhere in the city, other intellectual currents swirled. There were the sophists, the traveling teachers of rhetoric, who offered to teach any young man with enough money the skills of public speaking and persuasion. They promised not truth, but victory in debate. They taught how to make the weaker argument appear the stronger, a skill invaluable in the law courts and the political assembly. There were the famous orators, like Socrates, who ran their own schools, training the elite in the art of crafting beautiful and persuasive prose. Athens was a city in love with the power and beauty of its own voice. Diogenes, the exile from Sinope, witnessed all of this as the ultimate outsider. He arrived with no money, no connections, and no respect for the city's hallowed traditions. He looked at the Parthenon not as a symbol of divine wisdom, but as a pile of expensive stone, built with vanity and pride. He saw the finely dressed citizens and aspiring politicians in the Agora not as noble democrats, but as peacocks, preening and posturing for status. And when he listened to the endless talk, the sophisticated arguments, and the eloquent speeches, he heard something else. He heard a deep and profound disconnect between the city's lofty ideals and the reality of how its people lived. Athens, he quickly began to suspect, did not practice what it preached. The more Diogenes watched and listened, the more his initial suspicion hardened into a profound and searing contempt. The hypocrisy of Athens was not a subtle flaw, it was the city's defining characteristic. It was a city that had perfected the art of saying one thing and doing another. In the Agora, he heard orators speak with soaring eloquence about the importance of justice and the common good, only to see them later in the law courts using clever rhetorical tricks to defend a wealthy client they knew to be guilty. He saw men who publicly praised the virtues of moderation and self-control, yet in the evenings he would see them carried home, senseless with wine, from lavish banquets. He observed the city's religious life with the same critical eye. The Athenians built magnificent temples and performed elaborate sacrifices to the gods, proclaiming their piety to the world. But in their daily lives, he saw them driven by the most worldly of desires: greed, ambition, jealousy, and a lust for power. Their religion seemed to be another performance, a set of rituals to be completed in order to curry favor with the gods, rather than a true guide for moral living. It was, to him, a form of spiritual commerce, no different from a merchant bribing a harbor official. His sharpest critique, however, was reserved for the city's philosophers. He had come to Athens hoping to find wisdom, but instead, he found intellectual vanity. He listened on the fringes of the groups that gathered around Plato's students or the various sophists. He heard them engage in dazzlingly complex debates about the nature of reality, the definition of virtue, and the structure of the ideal state. They constructed intricate logical proofs and spun elaborate metaphysical theories. But to Diogenes, it was all just noise. It was a game of words, disconnected from the urgent and difficult business of actually living a good life. He watched as these supposed lovers of wisdom charged exorbitant fees to the wealthy young men who followed them. They had turned philosophy into a luxury good, a product to be bought and sold. They lived in comfortable homes, ate fine food, and wore expensive cloaks, all while preaching about the importance of the soul over the body. This, for Diogenes, was the ultimate betrayal. The philosophers of Athens were not seekers of truth. They were merchants, selling a more sophisticated and expensive product than the fishmongers and potters in the stalls nearby. The materialism of Sinope, he concluded, was at least honest. The materialism of Athens was far worse, for it cloaked itself in the noble language of virtue. He saw the city's celebrated democracy as another form of this hypocrisy. It was a system that praised the freedom of the citizen, yet it was built on the backs of a vast population of slaves who had no rights at all. The freedom of the few was directly dependent on the bondage of the many. He saw the stark contrast between the opulent villas of the rich and the squalid tenements of the poor. Athens spoke of being a community of equals, but to his outsider's eye, it was a city deeply divided by wealth and class. His initial response was likely one of quiet observation. He would have been a strange and unsettling figure, a shabbily dressed man with an intense gaze, standing at the edge of the crowds, listening. But eventually he would have begun to speak, not in long, eloquent speeches, but with short, sharp, probing questions. He would interrupt a complex lecture on the nature of justice with a simple, practical question that the lecturer could not answer. He might ask a philosopher who was defining the ideal man if he himself was that man. He would use his sharp, cynical wit, forged in the marketplaces of Sinope, to puncture the inflated egos of the city's intellectuals. These first encounters would have been revealing. He would have found that these men, who were masters of abstract thought, were utterly helpless when confronted with simple, concrete reality. They could talk for hours about the concept of goodness, but were flustered when asked a direct question about their own actions. Their wisdom, he realized, was a fragile thing, existing only in the realm of words. It shattered upon contact with the real world. This was the final stage of his disillusionment. He had arrived in Athens searching for a guide, for a model of how to live a virtuous life after his own had been destroyed. He found none. The city that was supposed to be the beacon of wisdom for all of Greece was, in his view, the most cleverly disguised fraud of all. It was a city of actors, and its philosophers were the most accomplished performers. He understood then that he would not find the answers he was looking for in any of Plato's lectures or in the schools of the sophists. If he wanted to find an honest way of living, he would have to forge it himself, in direct opposition to everything this celebrated city stood for. His war on convention had found its primary battlefield. He now needed a teacher, not of words, but of actions. And in the sprawling, hypocritical city of Athens, he would soon find the one man who could show him the way. Diogenes began a deliberate search. He was not looking for a school, but for a single honest man. He roamed the city, a ragged ghost haunting the places of learning. He observed the well-dressed young men entering and leaving Plato's academy, their minds filled with theories of perfect forms and ideal states, yet their lives indistinguishable from any other wealthy Athenian. He listened to the sophists in the agora, marveling at their ability to spin words into beautiful, empty tapestries. He saw that they were all selling the same product in different packaging. The promise of worldly success, cloaked in the language of wisdom. He rejected them all. They were part of the disease, not the cure. His search led him away from the grand, celebrated institutions and towards the fringes of the city. He would have heard rumors of another philosopher, an older man who was nothing like Plato or the orators. His name was Antisthenes. This was a name that carried a unique weight in Athens, for Antisthenes was not a second-generation interpreter of wisdom. He was a direct link to the source. He had been a close and devoted student of Socrates himself. He had walked the streets of Athens with the great master, listened to his interrogations, and was present during his final days. While Plato had taken Socrates' ideas and built a complex metaphysical cathedral upon them, Antisthenes had taken a different path. He had embraced the rugged, practical, and defiant spirit of his teacher and stripped it down to its barest, most essential core. Antisthenes had developed a philosophy of radical simplicity and self-sufficiency. He had listened to Socrates teach that virtue was the highest good, and he had pushed that idea to its absolute limit. For Antisthenes, virtue was not just the most important thing, it was the only thing. Everything else, wealth, status, power, health, even life itself, was a matter of complete indifference. He taught that virtue alone was sufficient for happiness, and that a truly virtuous man needed nothing that fortune could bestow or take away. He went even further, arguing that a life of hardship and toil, what the Greeks called ponos, was not something to be avoided, but was in fact a positive good, a form of training that strengthened the soul and led to virtue. Crucially, Antisthenes lived his philosophy. He was not a hypocrite. He had turned his back on the comforts that a philosopher of his standing could easily have enjoyed. He dressed in a single coarse woolen cloak, which he wore both summer and winter. He let his beard grow long and unkempt. He carried a simple wooden staff, not as a weapon, but as a tool for a life on the move, and a small leather pouch or wallet to carry his meager necessities. This simple uniform, the cloak, the staff, the wallet, was a public declaration of his independence from the world's values. He also made a deliberate choice about where to teach. He did not establish a formal school in a beautiful, secluded grove like Plato. Instead, he spent his time at the Cynicisarges. This was a public gymnasium located outside the city walls, on the other side of the Ilissos River. Its location was deeply significant. The Cynicisarges was designated for the use of not hoi, citizens of illegitimate birth, or, like Antisthenes himself, whose mother was a Thracian, those who had one non-Athenian parent. By teaching there, Antisthenes was making a powerful social statement. He was turning his back on the exclusive elitist circles of pure-blooded Athenian citizens and aligning himself with the outsiders, the marginalized, the people who didn't quite fit in. For Diogenes the Exile, a man stripped of his citizenship and his home, this act would have been a powerful beacon. Here was a philosopher who not only preached indifference to social status but actively sought out the company of those who lacked it. Diogenes made his way to the Cynicisarges. There, among the athletes and the outcasts, he saw him. Antisthenes was already an old man, tough and weathered like an ancient olive tree. There was nothing soft or academic about him. He did not lecture from a high chair but spoke plainly to those who would listen, his arguments punctuated by the grunts of wrestlers and the thud of the discus. In that moment, Diogenes knew his search was over. He was not looking at a man who merely taught philosophy. He was looking at a man who embodied it. He saw in Antisthenes' rugged self-sufficiency, in his weathered face, and in his complete lack of pretension, the authenticity he had been yearning to find. Plato's philosophy was to be read and debated. Antisthenes' philosophy was to be lived. Here was a man who had built his house upon the rock of his own character, impervious to the winds of public opinion and fortune. Diogenes had found his teacher. Now, he only had to convince the old man to accept a student, a task that would prove to be his first real test. Having identified his teacher, Diogenes began the difficult task of becoming his student. He approached Antisthenes directly, with the bluntness that would become his trademark. He stated his purpose simply. He wanted to learn from him. But Antisthenes was not seeking disciples. In his old age, he had grown famously cantankerous and had little patience for the crowds of young men who typically flocked around philosophers. He believed that virtue was a matter of character and action, not something that could be neatly packaged and delivered in a lecture. He had no interest in fame, no desire to found a school to rival Plato's. He saw Diogenes, another hopeful follower, and immediately dismissed him. Antisthenes told him to go away, that he had no need for students. But Diogenes did not leave. He had not come this far, lost everything he held dear, and finally found a glimmer of authenticity, only to be turned away by a harsh word. He did not argue. He did not try to debate or prove his intellectual worth. Instead, he simply began to follow. Day after day, the strange spectacle unfolded. The old, weathered philosopher would walk the streets of Athens or hold court at the Cynosarges, and a few paces behind him, like a silent, stubborn shadow, was the exile from Sinope. Diogenes' persistence was relentless. He endured the old man's scorn and his dismissive gestures. He slept near him on the steps of a public building, silently observing his every move. He was not asking for a doctrine to memorize. He was watching an art to be learned. He was studying the way Antisthenes walked, the way he ate his simple meal of lentils, the way he spoke to the powerful and the poor with the same indifference, the way he wrapped his single cloak around him against the night's chill. This went on for some time. Diogenes' silent, unwavering presence became a source of irritation for Antisthenes. The old philosopher, who valued his independence above all else, felt pursued. One day, his patience finally broke. As Diogenes approached him yet again, Antisthenes raised the heavy wooden staff he always carried and threatened him with it, shouting at him to leave him in peace. It was a moment of pure confrontation, a physical threat meant to finally drive the annoying pest away. What happened next became one of the defining legends of the Cynic school. Any other man would have recoiled in fear or anger. To be threatened with a beating in public was a deep humiliation. But Diogenes was already a master of his own shame. He did not flinch. He did not retreat. Instead, he simply bowed his head before the raised staff and said with calm finality, "Strike, for you will find no wood hard enough to drive me away from you, so long as I think you have something to say." In that moment, everything changed. Antisthenes lowered his staff, stunned into silence. This was not the response of a normal man. It was the response of a philosopher. Diogenes had demonstrated, in a single powerful act, that he already understood the core of Antisthenes' teaching. He had shown a complete contempt for physical pain and public humiliation in his pursuit of wisdom. He had proven that he saw hardship, ponos, not as a deterrent, but as an integral part of the path. He had passed the most difficult entrance exam without needing to be taught the lesson. He had shown his worth not with a clever argument, but with the raw courage of his character. From that day on, Antisthenes accepted him. Their relationship was never a conventional one. There were no formal classes, no tuition fees, no reading lists. It was an apprenticeship in the art of living freely. Antisthenes taught Diogenes by allowing him to observe, and by subjecting him to the harsh discipline of a life stripped bare. Diogenes began to consciously model himself after his master. He discarded whatever meager possessions he still had and adopted the Cynic uniform. His only property became a coarse cloak, a staff, and a leather wallet for his food. The lessons were practical and brutal. He learned to sleep on the bare ground, finding shelter in the porticos of temples. He learned to eat the cheapest food available, subsisting on a diet of lentils, wild vegetables, and barley cakes. He learned to drink only water, cupped in his hands from a public fountain. He forced his body to adapt to the extremes of the Athenian climate, deliberately exposing himself to the summer's heat and the winter's cold. This was the practice of Askēsis, a regimen of harsh, relentless training. It was not about punishing the body, but about liberating the soul from the body's demands. The goal was to systematically dismantle his own needs and desires until he was dependent on nothing and no one. He was forging his character in the fire of voluntary hardship, learning, step by painful step, how to be truly and completely self-sufficient. Under the tutelage of Antisthenes, Diogenes did more than just learn a philosophy. He sharpened it into a weapon. He took the foundational principles of his master, that virtue is the only good and that a life according to nature is the only path, and he began to push them to their most extreme and logical conclusions. Antisthenes had taught him the lyrics. Diogenes was about to give the song an unforgettable and shocking performance. He would not just follow in his master's footsteps. He would blaze a trail so radical that it would forever define the philosophy that came to be known as Cynicism. Antisthenes had, in his own way, withdrawn from the mainstream. He taught on the fringes of the city, content to be left alone with his small circle of outcasts. But Diogenes saw this as a form of retreat. To him, the point of this philosophy was not to hide from the world's follies, but to confront them head-on. He took the lessons learned at the Cynosarges and dragged them back into the very center of the agora. He transformed philosophy from a quiet practice of self-improvement into a loud, confrontational, and deeply public form of performance art. It was this provocative public style that likely earned them their famous name. The word cynic comes from the Greek kynikos, which means dog-like. There are several theories as to how they acquired this label. One is purely geographical. It may have originated from the Cynosarges gymnasium where Antisthenes taught. But the more enduring reason is that their behavior was seen by other Athenians as being literally like that of dogs. They neglected their appearance, they lived on the streets, they ate and performed other bodily functions in public without any sense of shame, and they would bark and snap at anyone who displeased them. It was meant as a stinging insult, a way to dehumanize them and dismiss their ideas. But just as he had done with his exile, Diogenes took this insult and embraced it as the perfect description of his mission. He did not deny the charge, he celebrated it. When people called him Diogenes the dog, he would simply wag his tail, metaphorically speaking. He began to actively model his behavior on that of a dog, arguing that in many ways, dogs were superior to human beings. A dog, he would point out, lives entirely in the present moment. It does not worry about the future or brood over the past. It is honest in its affections and its aggressions. It is loyal to its own nature and is free from the anxieties that plague humanity: ambition, greed, and the obsessive fear of what others think. He famously defined his own character in canine terms. When asked why people called him a dog, he is said to have replied, "Because I fawn on those who give me something, I yelp at those who refuse, and I sink my teeth into rascals." For him, the dog was the ultimate symbol of a life lived according to nature, or physis, in defiance of artificial human conventions, or nomos. To be a dog was to be honest, simple, and free. To fully embody this philosophy, he needed a home that reflected his complete independence. He found it in the form of a pithos, a large ceramic jar. These jars were common in the ancient world, often used to store wine, oil, or grain. They were large enough for a person to crawl inside. By choosing this as his dwelling, Diogenes made one of his most powerful philosophical statements. He rejected the very idea of a house, of private property, of a fixed place in the world. His home was not a place, but a possession, as portable as a snail's shell. It declared to the world that he needed nothing from society. Not its shelter, not its protection, not its approval. He was a completely self-contained unit, a kingdom of one. With this final act, his transformation was complete. Antisthenes had given him the intellectual framework and the initial example. But Diogenes had supplied the unforgettable theater. He had become the living embodiment of the philosophy, a walking, talking work of art designed to shock the citizens of Athens out of their complacency. He was no longer just the student of Antisthenes. He was Diogenes the dog, a self-appointed inspector of mankind, a warrior armed with nothing but his wit, his cloak, his staff, and his shamelessness. He had forged himself into the perfect tool for his mission, and he was now ready to unleash his unique brand of philosophical warfare upon the unsuspecting vanities of the most civilized city in the world. He was no longer learning the lessons of simplicity. He was about to teach them. Having forged his new identity as the dog, Diogenes began his life's work. His philosophy was not something to be written down in scrolls or debated in quiet gardens. It was to be lived, publicly and uncompromisingly, every single day. The foundation of this lived philosophy was a rigorous, relentless program of self-discipline that the Greeks called Askēsis. The word is the root of our modern term asceticism, but its original meaning was closer to the training and exercise an athlete undertakes to prepare for a competition. For Diogenes, life itself was the competition, and the prize was not an olive wreath, but a state of perfect freedom and virtue. His body and mind were his athletic equipment, and the world was his gymnasium. While other Athenian men spent their time in the gymnasium sculpting their bodies into idealized forms, Diogenes engaged in a far more demanding workout. He sought not muscular perfection, but spiritual invulnerability. His training regimen was simple. He would deliberately and systematically expose himself to every form of hardship and discomfort that he might encounter in life, in order to rob them of their power over him. He believed that civilization had made human beings soft, weak, and fearful. Comfort was a poison that enslaved the soul. The only antidote was a voluntary dose of hardship. His methods were direct and often shocking to onlookers. In the brutal heat of the Athenian summer, when others sought the shade of the colonnades, Diogenes could be seen rolling in the scorching hot sand, deliberately subjecting his skin to the torment of the sun. He was not a masochist seeking pain for its own sake. He was a spiritual athlete, training his body to endure heat so that the fear of heat could no longer command him. Conversely, in the biting cold of winter, he would walk barefoot through the frozen mud and was once seen embracing a snow-covered bronze statue, pressing his naked flesh against the freezing metal. His teeth would chatter, his body would tremble, but his will remained unbroken. He was teaching himself that cold was merely a sensation, not a true evil to be feared. This training extended to every aspect of his life. He deliberately controlled his hunger, eating only the simplest and cheapest foods, a handful of lentils, a few olives, a coarse barley cake. He wanted to prove that the human body needed very little to survive. By mastering his own hunger, he freed himself from the anxiety that drives most men to a life of toil and compromise. He would often obtain his food by begging, an act that was deeply shameful for a Greek citizen. But for Diogenes, this too was a form of Askēsis. It was training in humility and, more importantly, training in dealing with refusal. There is a famous story of him standing before a statue, holding out his hand and asking for alms. When a passerby asked him what he was doing, he replied, "I am practicing being rejected." Every day was a new exercise. He would enter public baths that were notoriously dirty and unpleasant. He would deliberately seek out hostile crowds and practice remaining calm in the face of their insults and ridicule. He saw every potential source of pain, discomfort, or humiliation not as something to be avoided, but as an opportunity for training. Each hardship overcome was like a new muscle developed in the soul. Each fear confronted and mastered was another chain broken. The ultimate goal of this relentless Askēsis was not to lead a miserable existence. It was the exact opposite. The goal was to achieve a state of inner tranquility and unshakable happiness. Diogenes's logic was simple and powerful. If you do not fear pain, then no one can control you with the threat of pain. If you do not fear hunger, then no one can command you with the promise of food. If you are indifferent to heat and cold, you are the master of your own comfort. And if you are not afraid of public opinion, then you are truly free to live according to your own reason. He saw his fellow Athenians as slaves, though they called themselves free. They were slaves to their possessions, slaves to their appetites for fine food and wine, slaves to their need for comfort, and above all, slaves to the good opinion of others. Their happiness was a fragile thing, entirely dependent on external circumstances. A lost shipment, a bad harvest, a political defeat, or a harsh word from a neighbor could shatter their peace of mind. Diogenes, by systematically detaching himself from all these things, was building an inner citadel, a fortress of the soul that no external event could ever breach. His happiness was not dependent on fortune, because he desired nothing that fortune could give, and he feared nothing that fortune could take away. This was the foundation of his freedom, a freedom so absolute that it would baffle and enrage the society around him. The relentless physical and mental training that Diogenes subjected himself to was not an end in itself. It was the means to achieve the supreme Cynic virtue, the state of being known as Autarkeia. This Greek word translates to self-sufficiency, but for Diogenes, it meant something far more profound and absolute than mere independence. It was a state of complete spiritual, emotional, and physical freedom, a condition in which a person's happiness is generated and sustained entirely from within, utterly immune to the storms of the external world. His Askēsis had built the fortress of his soul. Autarkeia was the peaceful kingdom that existed inside its walls. To achieve this state, Diogenes waged a war on a single powerful enemy: need. He believed that every need, every desire for something outside of oneself, was a weakness, a point of entry for unhappiness and a chain that yoked a person to fortune. A man who needs wealth is a slave to the marketplace. A man who needs power is a slave to public opinion. A man who needs comfort is a slave to his own body. To be free, one had to need nothing. And so, he began to systematically eliminate his needs, one by one. He started with possessions. He looked at the world around him and saw men who were owned by their property. Their lives were consumed by acquiring, protecting, and worrying about their things. Diogenes chose the opposite path. His earthly possessions were famously reduced to the barest minimum required for survival. He had his single, heavy cloak, which served as his clothing by day and his blanket by night. He had his wooden staff, which supported him as he walked and could be used to ward off aggressive dogs, both animal and human. And he had his leather wallet, a small pouch in which he might carry a few olives or a piece of a barley cake. This was the full inventory of his household. It was a public statement that a human being in their natural state required nothing more. But even this extreme minimalism was, in his view, not yet perfect. The most famous story illustrating his quest for absolute autarkeia concerns his last remaining utensil, a simple wooden cup. One morning, he was making his way to a public fountain to drink. He was carrying his cup, a simple functional object that he had likely owned for years. As he approached the fountain, he saw a young peasant boy get there before him. The boy had no cup. He simply knelt, cupped his hands together, and drank directly from the flowing water. Diogenes stopped and watched. A wave of understanding washed over him. For years, he had been priding himself on his simplicity, on his freedom from possessions. And in that instant, he realized he had been defeated in his own game by a child. He had been carrying an object that was completely superfluous. Nature had already provided him with the perfect tool for drinking, his own hands. In a gesture of profound insight, he tossed his cup aside, exclaiming, "A child has beaten me in simplicity of living." He had just shed another need, another layer of dependency on the artificial world of objects. He had become even freer. This drive for self-sufficiency extended beyond material things. He rejected society's most fundamental structures because he saw them as sources of dependency. He rejected the traditional family, viewing it as a web of emotional obligations and material anxieties that compromised an individual's freedom. He rejected the concept of the polis, the city-state, refusing to be a citizen of Athens or any other city. A city demanded loyalty and obedience to its laws, its nomos, which he saw as arbitrary and often contrary to the simple universal laws of nature. Because he needed nothing from society, society had no power over him. This was the source of his famous confidence and his fearless speech. He could insult the most powerful men in Athens because he wanted nothing from them. Not their money, not their patronage, not their approval. This radical independence was, in his view, the only true form of kingship. He once declared that the wise and virtuous man was the only real king. While a monarch like Alexander of Macedon ruled over vast lands and armies, his power was external and fragile. It depended on the loyalty of his generals and the wealth in his treasury. Diogenes, however, ruled over the kingdom of himself. He had complete mastery over his own desires, fears, and appetites. In this sense, he believed he was more powerful than any earthly king. He was invulnerable, for he had nothing that an enemy could take, threaten, or use as leverage against him. He was a king without a country, a throne, or a crown, and therefore a king who could never be deposed. This inner state of kingship, this radical self-sufficiency, was not something Diogenes kept to himself. The fortress of his soul had no drawbridge. Its gates were thrown wide open for all to see. The public expression of his inner freedom was perhaps the most challenging and controversial aspect of his philosophy, a principle the Greeks called Anaideia. The word can be translated as shamelessness, impudence, or a defiant lack of concern for public opinion. For Diogenes, Anaideia was not a personal failing or a sign of poor manners. It was a philosophical weapon, and his most effective tool for social critique. He had come to believe that the feeling of shame was the primary instrument of social control. Shame, he reasoned, was not a natural emotion. It was an artificial construct, a product of nomos or convention. Society teaches people to feel ashamed of certain natural actions, desires, and bodily functions in order to keep them conforming to an arbitrary set of rules. To be truly free, a person had to first liberate themselves from this invisible tyranny of shame. One had to learn to live with the shameless honesty of an animal or a small child. His logic was, as always, brutally simple. He observed the world around him and saw a deep hypocrisy in the distinction between public and private life. People would do certain things without a second thought behind the closed doors of their homes, but would be horrified at the thought of doing the same things in the open. Diogenes questioned this. If an act is not inherently wrong or harmful, why does the presence of an audience suddenly make it so? He concluded that this distinction was a lie, a convention designed to maintain a facade of public dignity while hiding the messy reality of human nature. In order to expose this lie, he decided to live his entire life in public, making no distinction between the private and the public sphere. His daily life became a series of calculated demonstrations designed to shock the Athenians into questioning their own inherited values. He began with simple things like eating. In ancient Greece, a formal meal was a social ritual, and even a simple lunch was typically taken in the privacy of one's home. To eat in the middle of the agora was considered crude, boorish. the behavior of a barbarian or an animal. Diogenes made a point of eating his simple meals of lentils or figs right in the busiest part of the marketplace. When onlookers would gather and criticize him, calling him a dog for eating in the street, he would calmly reply, "It is you who are the dogs, for you stand around and watch me while I eat my dinner." He was turning their own logic back on them, highlighting the absurdity of being more offended by the sight of a man eating than by their own intrusive staring. He pushed the boundaries further, deliberately violating every social taboo related to the body. He would spit freely, urinate in public, and sometimes even defecate in the theater. These were not the acts of a man who had lost control. They were the calculated provocations of a philosopher making a point. His actions were a physical argument. He was saying, "You build marble temples and talk of the immortal soul, but you are terrified of the simple, natural functions of the body that keeps that soul alive. You are hypocrites." His most famous and outrageous act of Anaideia was his practice of masturbating in public. He would perform the act openly in the marketplace, and when the crowd around him reacted with predictable horror and disgust, he would look up with a calm, untroubled expression and say, "If only it were so easy to soothe my hunger by rubbing my belly." This statement, so shocking to the ancient and modern ear, was a moment of brilliant, compressed philosophy. He was making two profound points at once. First, that a simple, natural, biological urge is not something to be ashamed of. Second, and more importantly, he was using the crowd's scandalized reaction to expose their warped sense of priority. They were a society that could be driven into a frenzy by a harmless, private act performed in public, yet they remained completely untroubled by the far greater obscenities they accepted as normal, the injustice of their law courts, the violence of their wars, and the greed that drove their politics. His act was a mirror, and it reflected a society that was scandalized by the trivial and blind to the truly evil. This was the ultimate purpose of his shamelessness. It was not mere exhibitionism. It was a form of shock therapy for a sick and complacent society. Like Socrates, he was a gadfly, sent to awaken the sleeping citizens from their dogmatic slumber. But while Socrates used questions, Diogenes used his body. By breaking every rule, he forced people to confront the rules themselves and to ask, why does this rule exist? Is it based on reason? Is it based on nature? Or is it just a mindless habit we have inherited from our ancestors? His shamelessness was the ultimate expression of his mission to deface the currency, the counterfeit currency of social convention. Having systematically dismantled his own needs, desires, and even his sense of shame, Diogenes was left with one final tie to the conventional world: his identity. In ancient Greece, when two men met, one of the first questions was always, "Where are you from?" The answer, "I am from Athens," or "I am from Corinth," was everything. It defined your loyalties, your legal rights, your place in the deeply fractured and competitive world of the Greek city-states. Your city, your polis, was the source of your identity. To be without a city was to be without a name, without protection, without a self. One day in the Athenian agora, a man put this very question to Diogenes. He looked at this strange, ragged figure living in a jar and asked him the standard question, perhaps with a hint of mockery, expecting the answer of a disgraced exile. "What is your country?" Diogenes's reply consisted of a single newly coined word, but it was a word that would echo through history and change the course of Western thought. He said, "Cosmopolites. I am a citizen of the world." It is difficult, from our modern perspective, to grasp the sheer, explosive radicalism of this statement. In the 4th century BC, it was an almost nonsensical claim. The world was sharply divided. First, it was divided between Greeks and everyone else, whom the Greeks dismissed as barbarians. Second, the Greek world itself was a fractured mosaic of hundreds of fiercely independent and often warring city-states. An Athenian saw a Spartan not as a fellow countryman, but as a lifelong rival and a potential enemy. The idea of a universal community, of a shared humanity that transcended the walls of one's own city and the boundaries of one's own culture, was a profoundly alien concept. Diogenes' claim was the logical culmination of his entire philosophy. Having rejected the artificial laws and customs, the nomos of a particular city in favor of the universal laws of nature, or physis, it made no sense for him to claim allegiance to any one place. If the only true laws are those of reason and nature, then those laws apply everywhere to everyone. The only true state, therefore, was the entire world, the cosmos itself. His citizenship was not defined by the arbitrary lines drawn on a map by politicians and generals, but by his participation in the universal community of rational beings. This was not just a clever rejection of his status as an exile. It was a positive and deeply humane affirmation. By declaring himself a citizen of the world, Diogenes was erasing all the artificial distinctions that societies use to divide people. The distinction between Athenian and Spartan, between Greek and barbarian, between citizen and foreigner, between a free man and a slave. All of these categories, which were so fundamental to the Greek worldview, simply vanished. He was proposing a new revolutionary form of identity, based not on the accident of one's birth, but on the shared capacity for reason. This idea grew directly out of his practice of self-sufficiency. Because his Askēsis had freed him from needing a city's protection, and his Autarkeia had freed him from needing its economy, and his Anaideia had freed him from needing its approval, he was able to see the world from a perspective that was simply unavailable to a normal citizen. He saw that the petty rivalries, the local prides, and the patriotic fervor that drove cities to war were all forms of vanity, illusions that blinded people to the larger truth of their shared existence. His cosmopolitanism was the final and most profound expression of his freedom. He was a man without a city, which meant that he was a man who could be at home everywhere. He could sleep in the portico of a temple in Athens or on the docks of Corinth with equal tranquility, because his true home was not a physical place, but the state of his own mind. While many of his other actions were primarily critical, designed to expose the follies of society, this idea was a stunningly positive contribution. It was a seed planted in the middle of a world defined by tribal loyalty. This seed would later be watered and cultivated by the Stoic philosophers. The Stoics, who were heavily influenced by the Cynics, took Diogenes' startling claim and made it a cornerstone of their own philosophy, developing it into the sophisticated concept of a universal brotherhood of man. It was an idea that would resonate through the Roman Empire, which itself was a vast, multi-ethnic state, and would eventually find its echoes in the Enlightenment and in the modern language of universal human rights. It all began with a single defiant word from a homeless man living in a jar. He was the first to declare that our primary allegiance should not be to a flag or a tribe, but to humanity itself. Having declared his citizenship to the cosmos, Diogenes was now fully armed. His body was trained, his mind was self-sufficient, and his spirit was free from the shackles of convention. He was a living embodiment of his philosophy, a walking, breathing critique of the world around him. He now began to systematically aim his philosophical weapons at the most powerful and respected figures in Athens. And in the intellectual landscape of the city, there was no target more prominent, and no philosophical opposite more perfect than Plato. The two men represented the absolute poles of Greek thought. Plato was the ultimate insider. He was an Athenian aristocrat, the celebrated head of the prestigious academy, a brilliant writer whose dialogues would shape the course of Western philosophy for the next 2 millennia. His entire philosophical project was aimed upwards, towards a higher unseen reality. He taught his students to distrust the senses and the material world, and to use pure reason to contemplate the perfect eternal world of the forms. His was a philosophy of idealism, of abstraction, communicated through elegant, sophisticated, and carefully crafted arguments. Diogenes was his perfect antithesis. He was the ultimate outsider, a disgraced exile, a homeless beggar, a philosopher of the street. His entire philosophical project was aimed squarely downwards, at the gritty, messy, immediate reality of lived experience. He taught that truth was not to be found in abstract theories, but in the concrete actions of one's daily life. He distrusted elegant language, seeing it as a mask to hide hypocrisy. He communicated not through written dialogues, but through shocking actions and short, biting, witty remarks. He was the champion of the material, the physical, the here and now. The conflict between them was not born of simple personal rivalry. It was a fundamental clash over the very soul of philosophy. Diogenes saw Plato's entire intellectual enterprise as a dangerous and profoundly arrogant distraction. He believed that by teaching wealthy young men to contemplate a perfect imaginary world of forms, Plato was giving them an excuse to ignore the urgent ethical demands of the real world. Plato's philosophy, in his view, was an elaborate and beautiful escape, a flight from the difficult business of living a virtuous life. Diogenes had appointed himself the man to drag philosophy back down to earth, and Plato was his primary target. He began to regularly disrupt the life of the academy. He would sometimes walk into the shaded groves where Plato lectured, sit down, and begin loudly munching on some figs or radishes, deliberately interrupting the refined intellectual atmosphere with the vulgar sounds of eating. He was making a simple, powerful point. Your lofty thoughts depend on this simple, physical act, so do not pretend you are above it. His most famous and devastating attack, however, was a masterpiece of philosophical theater. The story begins in one of Plato's lectures. Using his preferred method of definition by classification, Plato was attempting to define the essence of a human being. After some discussion, he arrived at a definition that was, within his logical system, perfectly sound. He declared, "Man is a biped animal without feathers." Word of this definition quickly spread through the city. To most, it probably sounded like a clever, if slightly odd, piece of academic reasoning. But when Diogenes heard it, he recognized it as the perfect example of everything he found absurd and useless in Plato's philosophy. It was a definition that was technically correct but completely missed the point. It was an abstraction that had lost all contact with reality. And he decided he would demonstrate its absurdity in the most literal way possible. His response was not a counter-argument. It was an ambush. He went out and found a chicken or a rooster. He then painstakingly plucked every single feather from the poor, squawking bird. With his living, shivering prop in hand, he marched directly to the academy. He didn't wait at the gate. He stormed right into the middle of Plato's lecture, where the master was surrounded by his earnest, aristocratic students. Holding the pathetic, naked, and terrified bird aloft for all to see, Diogenes proclaimed with a loud, theatrical voice, "Behold, I have brought you Plato's man." The effect must have been electrifying. In an instant, the serene intellectual atmosphere of the academy was shattered. The students would have erupted in a mixture of shock, confusion, and laughter. Plato himself was publicly and profoundly humiliated. With a single, brilliant act of satire, Diogenes had revealed the hollowness of the abstract definition. He had shown, more powerfully than any argument could, that a neat logical formula could not hope to capture the strange, complex, and messy reality of a living being. The story goes that Plato, flustered and embarrassed, was forced to amend his definition on the spot, adding the qualifier, and having broad, flat nails. But the damage was done. The story of the plucked chicken would be told all over Athens, a constant, comical reminder of the day the street dog had outwitted the master of the academy. It was a decisive victory for lived reality over abstract theory. Having successfully challenged the king of the intellectual world, Diogenes would soon face an even greater test. His philosophy would be brought face to face not with an abstract argument, but with the most absolute physical and political power the world had ever known. He would confront a man who was not merely a thinker, but a force of nature, a living legend whose name was already spoken with awe and fear across all of Greece. The young king of Macedon, Alexander the Great. The famous encounter did not take place in Athens, but most likely in the city of Corinth. Alexander, a young man barely in his 20s, had recently inherited the throne after the assassination of his father, Philip II. With astonishing speed and ruthlessness, he had crushed all opposition and consolidated his father's mastery over the Greek city-states. He had come to Corinth to be officially acclaimed as the leader or hegemon of the Panhellenic League, and to finalize his plans for the great invasion of the Persian Empire, a campaign that would change the course of history. He was the master of the world, and the world knew it. Upon his arrival in Corinth, a procession of the most important figures in Greece flocked to his court. Statesmen, famous poets, renowned artists, and influential philosophers all came to pay homage to the young conqueror. It was a carefully orchestrated display of power and influence. They came to offer their congratulations, to pledge their loyalty, and to bask in the reflected glory of his power, hoping to win his favor. Everyone who was anyone in Greece came to bow before Alexander. Everyone, that is, except Diogenes. Alexander, who had been tutored by the great philosopher Aristotle, had a genuine appreciation for the power of ideas. He noticed the conspicuous absence of the most talked about and controversial philosopher in Greece. His curiosity was piqued. Here was a man living in his own kingdom of one, who apparently had no interest in the man who ruled the rest of the world. Intrigued by a subject who desired nothing from his king, Alexander decided to reverse the natural order of things. If the philosopher would not come to the king, then the king would go to the philosopher. So the great spectacle began. Alexander, dressed in the armor of a general and surrounded by his magnificent retinue, his bodyguards, his companions, the splendidly attired generals who would help him conquer Asia, made his way through the city to the Cranium, a sunny gymnasium on the outskirts of Corinth where Diogenes was known to spend his days. They found him easily. He was lying on the ground, enjoying the warmth of the morning sun. He was completely indifferent to the commotion his visitors were causing. He saw the crowd of soldiers and aristocrats approaching, but he did not move. He did not stand. He did not offer any sign of respect or deference. He simply watched them come, as a lizard on a rock might watch a cloud pass overhead. Alexander strode forward and stood over the reclining figure. He tried to be magnanimous, to project the easy confidence of a king. He spoke first, introducing himself with the simple, awe-inspiring title he had earned. "I am Alexander the Great." Diogenes, squinting up at the figure blocking his sun, replied with his own equally simple title, "And I am Diogenes the dog." A wave of shock must have passed through Alexander's companions. The sheer impudence was breathtaking. But Alexander, perhaps amused, pressed on. He decided to display his royal power, his ability to grant any wish. He made a grand offer. "Ask of me any boon you like," he said. This was the ultimate test. The master of the world was offering this penniless beggar anything he desired. Wealth, a home, political favor, anything at all. Diogenes did not ask for gold. He did not ask for a pardon to return to Sinope. He did not even engage in a philosophical debate. He simply shifted his gaze slightly from Alexander's face to his body, which was casting a shadow over him. He made the smallest of gestures and said the most revolutionary words a beggar has ever spoken to a king. "Stand out of my light." The king's entourage was furious. They saw the remark for what it was, an unforgivable insult. They began to murmur that this filthy dog should be whipped for his insolence. But Alexander silenced them. He was not a mere brute. He was a man of extraordinary intelligence. And in that moment he understood. He understood the profound depth of Diogenes' statement. This man was telling him, the master of the earth, that he possessed nothing that the philosopher truly wanted. The only thing of value that Alexander could give him was something that cost nothing, the light of the sun, and even that he was currently taking away. Alexander stared at the man on the ground, a man who possessed a freedom so total and so absolute that it was beyond the reach of any king or conqueror. A deep sense of admiration, perhaps even envy, washed over him. He turned to his grumbling, splendidly dressed generals and companions, and spoke one of the most famous verdicts in history. "Truly," he said, "if I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes." It was the ultimate acknowledgement of one king to another. In the great battle between worldly power and inner freedom, the dog in the sunlight had won. Having held his own against the master of the intellectual world and the master of the political world, Diogenes turned his relentless critical gaze upon the people themselves. He had examined the elites and found them wanting. Now he would put the ordinary citizen to the test. He did this not through debate, but through one of his most enduring and memorable pieces of street theater, his famous search for a man. The spectacle would begin without warning. In the middle of the day, with the bright Attic sun high overhead, Diogenes would light a lamp. A lit lamp in broad daylight was a bizarre and nonsensical sight, and it was designed to be exactly that. It was the opening act, the curtain rising on his public stage. Clutching the flickering, smoking lamp, he would begin to walk slowly and deliberately through the most crowded parts of the city, usually the bustling agora. He would walk with an air of great purpose, as if on a mission of the utmost urgency. He would hold the lamp up high, peering into the alleyways, scanning the colonnades, and most provocatively, thrusting the lamp directly into the faces of the men he passed. He would examine the faces of the wealthy merchants haggling over prices, the politicians trying to win votes, the young aristocrats preening in their fine robes, and the craftsmen busy at their work. His expression was one of intense, frustrated searching. Inevitably, a crowd of amused and curious onlookers would gather. They saw this performance as a welcome diversion, the latest antic from the city's resident madman. Someone from the crowd would finally shout the obvious question, "Diogenes, what are you doing with a lamp in the middle of the day?" He would pause, look around at the faces surrounding him with a gaze of profound disappointment, and deliver his devastatingly simple reply, "I am looking for a man." The genius of this act lay in its layered meaning. On the surface, it was absurd, but beneath the absurdity was a deep and damning philosophical indictment. When the onlookers would protest, saying, "But we are all men. The agora is full of them," Diogenes' continued, fruitless search made his true point clear. He did not consider them to be men at all. He was implying that the citizens of Athens, for all their pride in their civilization, were merely human in shape. They were not living up to the true potential of a human being. So, what kind of man was Diogenes searching for? He was not looking for a biological specimen. He was looking for a human being who was fully actualized, a person who lived a life of true integrity. In his view, this ideal human would have several key qualities. First, they would be rational. They would live their life according to reason, not according to mindless habit, emotional impulse, or the pressures of social conformity. They would question everything and think for themselves. Second, they would be virtuous. This was not about mouthing platitudes about justice and goodness. It was about living a life where one's actions were in perfect harmony with one's principles. He was looking for an honest man, a person without hypocrisy. Finally, and most importantly, they would be natural. They would live in accordance with physis, their own human nature, and the laws of the cosmos. They would have stripped away the artificial layers of nomos, the conventions and vanities that society demanded. The devastating punchline of his performance was that he never found one. His endless, public, and very theatrical search was a continuous, silent judgment on the entire city. He was holding up his lamp not to see, but to be seen, and to force the people of Athens to see themselves. He was showing them that for all their magnificent temples, their democratic assemblies, and their brilliant philosophical schools, they had failed in the most fundamental task of all, the task of being truly and authentically human. This theme, the scarcity of true humanity, ran through many of his other actions and sayings. He would often refer to men in general in contemptuous terms. Seeing a house with a notice on the door that read, "Let nothing evil enter here," Diogenes asked, "How then can the master of the house get in?" Upon seeing the officials of a temple leading away a man who had stolen a bowl, he remarked, "The great thieves are leading away the little thief." Each of these remarks was a small flicker from his philosophical lamp, an attempt to illuminate the hidden hypocrisy of the world around him. His search was not a genuine quest. It was a statement. The man he was looking for could not be found, because he had to be created, forged in the fires of discipline and self-examination. Beyond his legendary confrontations with Plato and Alexander, and his tireless search for a man, Diogenes' entire life was a continuous rolling performance of philosophical satire. His days were filled with countless smaller encounters, each one a perfectly crafted barb aimed at the follies of the world. These lesser-known stories, passed down through the centuries, paint an even richer picture of his relentless wit and the sheer consistency of his worldview. His critiques were not limited to philosophy. He often targeted simple incompetence. He was once watching an archer practice who was notoriously unskilled. Arrow after arrow flew wide of the mark. After observing for a few moments, Diogenes calmly walked over and sat down on the ground directly beside the target. A concerned bystander rushed over and asked him what on earth he was doing. "It's the only place on the field," Diogenes replied, "where I can be sure I won't get hit." The act was a brilliant, physical joke, a far more powerful statement on the archer's ineptitude than any verbal insult. He had a particular contempt for the abstract logical puzzles that were popular among some philosophical schools. He was once confronted with a famous paradox, designed to trap the listener in a logical fallacy. A man asked him, "What you have not lost, you still have. Is that correct?" Diogenes agreed. "And you have not lost horns, have you?" The man continued. Diogenes agreed again. Then the man concluded triumphantly, "You have horns." Instead of trying to deconstruct the faulty logic of the argument, Diogenes simply reached up and touched his own forehead. "I for my part do not see any," he said. With a simple physical gesture, he dismissed the entire pointless game, reaffirming his commitment to tangible reality over clever, empty words. His sharpest attacks were often reserved for the wealthy and the pretensions that came with their riches. He was once invited into the magnificent home of a very wealthy, but notoriously vulgar man. The owner was showing Diogenes his opulent decorations, the fine statues, and the polished marble floors. Knowing Diogenes' habit of spitting freely, the owner said, "Please, Diogenes, be careful where you spit. Everything here is of the finest quality." Diogenes looked around the room, his eyes scanning every beautiful, expensive object. Then, he turned and spat directly in the owner's face. As the man recoiled in shock and anger, Diogenes calmly explained, "I could not find a more foul and worthless place to spit." He saw the corruption of wealth not just in the rich, but in their children. Once, at a banquet, he saw the son of a thief stealing from the other guests. He went over to the boy and said, "Be careful, my boy, your father is watching." On another occasion, he saw the son of a notoriously vain man. He pointed to the father, who was lavishly dressed and perfumed, and announced to the crowd, "This is the son," then pointed to the young boy and said, "And that is the father." The insult was devastatingly precise, suggesting the father's vanity was a form of childish immaturity. He held a deep skepticism for democracy and the wisdom of the crowd. As he was once walking out of a public bath, he was met by a group of his acquaintances who were about to enter. "Any great crowd in there?" they asked him. "No," Diogenes replied, "but a good number of bathers." The distinction was critical. A large number of people did not equate to a great community. Another time, he entered a theater by the exit, walking against the tide of the crowd that was leaving. When people shouted at him, asking why he was going the wrong way, he replied, "This is the direction I have been practicing walking my entire life." His wit was a constant presence, a running commentary on the human condition. When asked what was the most beautiful thing in the world, he replied, "Parrhesia," which means free and fearless speech. When asked what the proper time was to eat a meal, he gave a different answer for the rich and the poor. "If you are a rich man, whenever you wish. If you are a poor man, whenever you can." It was a simple yet profound statement on social inequality. And when a man asked him where in Greece he had seen good men, Diogenes gave a famously sharp reply. "Good men I have seen nowhere. Good boys I have seen in Sparta." It was a biting critique, suggesting that even the famously disciplined Spartans were inevitably corrupted by the temptations of adulthood. Each of these encounters, small and large, added another thread to the rich tapestry of his philosophy, a philosophy that was not written, but lived, one witty and defiant act at a time. For years, Diogenes had reigned as the undisputed king of his own life. Through his relentless training, he had achieved a state of freedom so complete that even Alexander the Great could only look on in envy. He was the master of his own soul, seemingly invulnerable to the whims of fortune. But the world is a chaotic and violent place, and not even the most self-sufficient philosopher is immune to the brute force of others. His philosophy, forged in the pain of exile and tested in the daily battles of the Athenian agora, was about to face its most extreme and unexpected trial. The event occurred when Diogenes was already an old man. He was on a voyage by sea, heading towards the island of Aegina. We can imagine him on the deck of the ship, a still figure amidst the other passengers, indifferent to the wind and the waves. Perhaps for a moment there was a sense of peace. He was away from the dense, suffocating hypocrisy of the city, surrounded by the simple, honest elements of sun, salt, and water. He was a citizen of the world, and the sea was as much his home as any other place. That peace was shattered by the cry of a lookout. On the horizon, a ship was approaching, moving with a speed and aggression that marked it not as a merchant vessel, but as a predator. It was a pirate ship. In the ancient Mediterranean, piracy was a constant and terrifying menace. It was a brutal business, and the men who practiced it were known for their ruthlessness. Panic would have erupted on Diogenes' ship. The passengers and crew, seeing the inevitable, would have been seized by a primal fear, the fear of death or worse, of enslavement. Amidst the chaos, as the pirates boarded the ship with swords drawn, Diogenes remained a figure of strange calm. He had spent his entire life preparing for misfortune. He had trained himself not to fear pain, not to fear loss, and not to fear death. While others wept or pleaded for their lives, he observed the scene with the detached curiosity of a philosopher. He was a spectator at his own capture. The pirates, seeing this wiry, unkempt old man who showed no fear, would have been perplexed, but they bound him along with the other captives. His freedom of movement was gone, but the freedom of his mind remained untouched. The pirates sailed to Crete, which at the time was a major center for the slave trade. There, Diogenes and the other unfortunate captives were brought to the slave market to be sold. The scene was one of ultimate degradation. The captives were stripped and put on display like livestock. Potential buyers would walk among them, inspecting their teeth, poking their muscles, and assessing their capacity for labor. Men, women, and children who just days before had been free citizens were now reduced to mere objects, their worth to be determined by the highest bidder. Despair and humiliation hung heavy in the air. In the midst of this scene of human misery, Diogenes stood on the auction block. He was old, thin, and clad in his usual ragged cloak. To any practical buyer, he looked like a worthless piece of property. He was too old for hard labor, too scruffy to be a house servant, and his defiant posture suggested he would be difficult to manage. The auctioneer, a man whose job it was to find a selling point for any piece of merchandise, was faced with a challenge. He approached Diogenes and asked the standard question put to any slave with a potential skill: "What can you do?" Any other person in this situation would have tried to name a practical craft. "I can farm, I am a scribe, I am a carpenter," anything to make themselves seem useful and perhaps fetch a better price, ensuring a less brutal master. Diogenes's reply was something no one in that market had ever heard before. He looked the auctioneer in the eye and, with a clear, steady voice, said, "I can govern men." A stunned silence likely fell over the immediate area. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of the statement was almost incomprehensible. Here was a man in chains, a piece of property about to be sold, and his declared skill was the skill of a king. Before the auctioneer could even react, Diogenes seized control of the entire situation. He pointed to the crowd of wealthy, prospective buyers and commanded the auctioneer, as if the auctioneer were his own servant, "Then make a proclamation. Announce that if any man here wishes to buy himself a master, he should come to me." This was not just a witty retort. It was a complete reversal of the reality of the situation. Diogenes refused to accept the role of a slave. He was asserting, in this place of ultimate powerlessness, that true mastery does not come from legal status or physical force. It comes from character, from wisdom, from the ability to govern oneself and, therefore, to guide others. He was turning the auction into an interview, a search for a man intelligent enough to understand the value of what was truly being offered. Even in chains, his spirit was so free that he could look upon his own sale not as a degradation, but as an opportunity. He had proven to himself and to the world that the inner citadel he had built was truly impregnable. Diogenes's audacious proclamation that he was a master for sale hung in the air of the Cretan slave market. The crowd of buyers, accustomed to assessing slaves based on their physical strength and docile appearance, would have been baffled. Most would have dismissed him as a madman, a worthless and potentially troublesome piece of property. But his words had not fallen on entirely deaf ears. In the crowd that day was a man of unusual perception. His name was Xeniades, a wealthy and cultivated gentleman from the great city of Corinth. Xeniades was not looking for a laborer to work his fields or a servant to polish his silver. He was a man of the world, and he recognized something extraordinary in the defiant old man on the auction block. He saw not madness, but an incredible strength of character. He was intrigued by the sheer force of will it took for a man in chains to declare himself a ruler. Perhaps it was curiosity, perhaps it was a moment of insight, but Xeniades decided to take the philosopher at his word. He approached the auctioneer and purchased Diogenes. The transaction itself was a perfect paradox. In the eyes of the law, Xeniades had just bought a slave. In the mind of Diogenes, he had just found a new household to govern. As they journeyed from Crete to Xeniades' home in Corinth, the nature of their relationship quickly became clear. Diogenes did not adopt the posture of a slave. He did not walk with his head bowed. He spoke to Xeniades not with the deference of a servant, but with the confidence of an advisor and the authority of a teacher. He famously told his new legal owner, "You must obey me, though I am your slave, for if a physician or a steersman were a slave, he would be obeyed." Xeniades, to his immense credit, was intelligent enough to understand. He realized he had not purchased a simple servant, but a living treasure of wisdom and integrity. Upon arriving at his home, He did not send Diogenes to the kitchens or the stables. Instead, he made a remarkable and inspired decision. He entrusted his new slave with the most important responsibility in his household: the education and upbringing of his two young sons. Diogenes took on the role of tutor not as a job, but as his philosophical duty. He had found his kingdom. His teaching methods were as unconventional as the man himself. He was not interested in filling the boys' heads with the fashionable rhetorical tricks or abstract theories that were popular in Athens. He was interested in forging their character. His curriculum was the philosophy of Cynicism, taught not through lectures, but through direct practical application. He immediately subjected the boys to a modified form of his own Askēsis. He stripped them of their luxurious clothes and dressed them in simple, plain tunics. He made them cut their hair short. He insisted they eat plain, simple food and drink only water. He took them out of the sheltered environment of their wealthy home and made them engage with the world. He trained them to exercise, to ride, to hunt, and to endure physical hardship without complaint. He wanted to make their bodies as tough and resilient as their minds. He did teach them some traditional subjects, compelling them to memorize long passages from Homer and other poets, not for the beauty of the verse, but as a rigorous exercise for the memory. Above all, he taught them to be self-sufficient, to rely on themselves, and to value virtue, honesty, and courage above wealth or status. He was raising them not to be pampered aristocrats, but to be the kind of men he had been searching for with his lamp. According to some accounts, his authority soon extended beyond the children to the entire household. Xeniades, seeing the positive effect Diogenes had on his sons, put him in charge of managing the entire estate. Diogenes the slave became Diogenes the household manager. He would have run the house with a firm and efficient hand, eliminating waste, dismissing lazy servants, and bringing a new level of discipline and order. The other slaves, who were legally his equals, came to respect and obey him as their de facto master. He had no legal authority, but his moral and intellectual authority were undeniable. This period of his life in Corinth was the ultimate vindication of his entire philosophy. It was the perfect real-world proof of his central claims. He had demonstrated that freedom is an internal state that cannot be taken away by external circumstances. He had proven that true mastery is a quality of character, not a legal title. He, a slave in name, lived more freely and with more authority than his master. And Xeniades, his master in name, benefited immeasurably by submitting to the wisdom of his slave. The relationship was a living paradox, a complete inversion of the social order, and perhaps the greatest of all Diogenes' philosophical triumphs. He had shown the world that even in chains, the wise man is the only true king. Diogenes lived out the remainder of his days in Corinth. His period of legal enslavement in the house of Xeniades eventually came to an end, though he remained a close friend and advisor to the family. He was now a fixture of the city, a living landmark. He was still the sharp-tongued critic, still the man who lived in a jar, but his reputation had subtly shifted. He was no longer seen merely as a madman or a public nuisance. He was now widely, if grudgingly, respected as a figure of formidable integrity and wisdom. He had proven through his actions that his philosophy was not just a performance, but a genuine path to virtue. But even the toughest, most self-sufficient of men must eventually face the same end. As he approached the age of 90, the story of Diogenes the dog entered its final chapter. Fittingly for a man whose life was a tapestry of legend, his death is recounted in not one, but several different stories. Each account is a kind of parable, a final lesson that seeks to capture the essence of his philosophy. It is unlikely that any of them are literally true, but they all contain a deeper truth about the man he was. One of the most visceral stories claims that he died from eating a raw octopus. In a final extreme act of living according to nature, he supposedly attempted to eat the octopus without cooking it, as any other animal would. The meal, however, proved too much for his old body, and it killed him. This version of his death serves as a stark symbol of his absolute commitment to his principles. A man who literally died for his belief in a raw, natural existence. Another, more ironic tale suggests that he died from an infected dog bite. The image of Diogenes the dog, the man who had embraced that title his entire life, being brought down by his own namesakes, is full of a dark, poetic justice. It portrays a man so intertwined with the natural world that he ultimately fell victim to its simple, unthinking violence. The most philosophically potent and perhaps most famous account of his death, however, is the one that presents it not as an accident, but as his final, conscious act of will. This story claims that Diogenes simply decided it was time to die, and so he did, by voluntarily holding his breath. This legend portrays his death as the ultimate expression of his autarkeia. He had achieved such perfect mastery over himself that he could command not only his desires and his fears, but the very process of life itself. His death was not something that happened to him. It was something he did. It was his last and greatest act of defiance, a final proof that his will was sovereign over all things, even his own body. While these stories provide powerful endings to his legend, the historical reality is almost certainly more mundane. Diogenes, a man who had lived a hard life for nearly 90 years, likely died of simple old age, his body finally failing him. But it is a testament to the power of his life that people felt his death required a more dramatic and meaningful explanation. In a final, stunning coincidence, ancient tradition, most notably recorded by Diogenes Laertius, holds that Diogenes died in the year 323 BC, on the very same day as Alexander the Great. The symbolism of this shared departure is immense. The two men, the two kings who had once met in the sunlight of Corinth, left the world together. Alexander, the master of the external world, died in his palace in Babylon, racked with fever, his vast empire already beginning to fracture. Diogenes, the master of the internal world, died quietly in Corinth, his philosophical kingdom perfectly intact. The simultaneous death of the conqueror and the beggar marked the symbolic end of an era. His final philosophical statements were concerned with his own body. As he lay dying, his friends and followers, including the sons of Xeniades, gathered around him. They asked him how he wished to be buried. The funeral rites were a matter of supreme importance to the Greeks, a sacred duty to ensure the soul's peaceful passage to the afterlife. Diogenes' reply was his last and greatest shock. He instructed them simply to throw his body over the city walls, to be devoured by the wild dogs and other beasts. His friends were horrified. To leave a body unburied, to allow it to be eaten by animals, was the ultimate desecration, a terrible fate reserved for the worst of enemies. They protested that they could not bear the thought of it. In that case, Diogenes said, ever the pragmatist, just leave a stick next to me so I can wave them away. His friends, confused, pointed out the obvious flaw in his plan. But you will not be conscious, they said. You will not feel a thing. Diogenes then delivered his final, irrefutable punchline. If then I shall have no consciousness, he concluded, why should I care what happens to this body? With his last words, he dismantled one of the most powerful and deeply ingrained fears of his culture. He demonstrated his ultimate indifference to the fate of his physical self. His body had been a tool, a vessel for his philosophy. Now that he was done with it, it was of no more consequence than the wooden cup he had thrown away years before. He had lived without fear, and he would die without it. Diogenes had willed his body to the dogs, but his ideas belonged to the world, and the world was not yet ready to let them go. Despite his final shocking request, the people of Corinth did not throw his body over the city walls. The man who had lived his life as an outcast was, in death, claimed by the very society he had criticized. They gave him an honorable public funeral. His friends and admirers, including the family of Xeniades, erected a monument over his grave near the city gate, a tall marble column, and perched atop it, the simple, powerful image of a dog, forever guarding the memory of its master. His influence did not die with him. It lived on through the small but dedicated group of followers who had been inspired by his radical example. The most famous of his direct disciples was a man named Crates of Thebes. Crates was a man from a very wealthy and respected family, who, upon encountering the Cynic philosophy, was so profoundly moved that he gave away his entire vast fortune. He abandoned his life of privilege and, along with his wife Autarkeia, who did the same, chose to live the life of a wandering Cynic beggar on the streets of Athens. This act alone was a testament to the life-altering power of Diogenes' example. Crates and his followers kept the flame of Cynicism alive, a small, flickering protest against the vanities of the world. But Diogenes' most significant and world-changing legacy would flow through a man he never met. It was a legacy that would transform his raw, confrontational philosophy into one of the most enduring and influential ethical systems in human history. This legacy began, as so many ancient stories do, with a shipwreck. Around the year 300 BC, some 2 decades after the death of Diogenes, a wealthy Phoenician merchant named Zeno of Citium was caught in a violent storm while sailing near the coast of Attica. His ship, laden with a valuable cargo of purple dye, was destroyed, and he was washed ashore near the port of Athens with nothing but his life. Having lost his entire fortune in a single stroke of fate, Zeno, like Diogenes before him, was now an exile, a man stripped of his former life. He made his way into Athens and, seeking some kind of consolation, wandered into a bookseller's shop. There, he picked up a copy of Xenophon's Memorabilia, a book of recollections about the life and conversations of Socrates. He was captivated. He read of Socrates' integrity, his courage, and his relentless search for virtue. Inspired, Zeno turned to the bookseller and asked a simple, fateful question. "Where can I find a man like that?" At that very moment, as if summoned by fate, Crates of Thebes, the ragged disciple of Diogenes, happened to be walking past the shop. The bookseller simply lifted his hand, pointed to the strange figure in the street, and said, "Follow that man." Zeno did. He became a student of Crates, and for many years, he immersed himself in the Cynic philosophy. He learned the core lessons that had been pioneered by Diogenes. He learned that virtue is the only true good. He learned that things like wealth, health, and reputation are ultimately matters of indifference. He learned the importance of living a life in accordance with nature and reason. He absorbed the Cynic contempt for convention and the cosmopolitan ideal of being a citizen of the world. The foundational ethics of Diogenes were poured directly into the mind of Zeno. But Zeno was a different kind of man. He possessed the raw courage of the Cynics, but he also had a gift for systematic thought. He realized that while the core message of Cynicism was profoundly true, its outer form, the shamelessness, the deliberate squalor, the confrontational lifestyle, was a barrier that most people could not and would not cross. He decided to adapt the philosophy to keep its hard, ethical core but to clothe it in a more accessible and dignified form. He began to teach, not in a gymnasium or from a jar, but in a public colonnade in the Athenian agora, the stoa or painted porch. It is from this place that his new philosophy would get its name, Stoicism. Zeno took the fire of Diogenes and channeled it. He kept the fundamental idea that happiness comes from an inner state of virtue, which he called a life lived in agreement with nature. He kept the Cynic indifference to external events, refining it into the Stoic concept of apatheia, a state of tranquility free from disturbing passions. He kept the cosmopolitan ideal, making the brotherhood of all mankind a central pillar of his thought. But he rejected the Anaideia, the shamelessness. A Stoic was not required to live like a dog. On the contrary, Stoics were encouraged to be responsible members of society, to be good parents, loyal friends, and dutiful citizens. They were to participate in public life, not withdraw from it. He also refined the idea of indifference. While Diogenes rejected wealth and health as meaningless, Zeno classified them as preferred indifference. It is natural to prefer health to sickness and wealth to poverty, but a Stoic's virtue and happiness must never depend on them. In this act of adaptation, Zeno performed a miracle. He took the radical, seemingly unlivable philosophy of a homeless exile and transformed it into a practical, powerful system that could be practiced by anyone, from a slave like Epictetus to a Roman emperor like Marcus Aurelius. Stoicism would go on to become the dominant ethical philosophy of the Hellenistic and Roman worlds for the next 500 years. And at its heart, beating with a defiant and uncompromising pulse, were the core insights of the man who started it all. Diogenes the dog was the angry, brilliant, and undisputed grandfather of Stoicism. While Stoicism carried the refined ethical fire of Diogenes into the mainstream of the Roman world, the raw, untamed spirit of the man himself was never fully forgotten. The figure of Diogenes the dog, the witty, shameless, and utterly free individual, was too powerful to be erased. He became a kind of philosophical folk hero, a permanent ghost in the machine of Western civilization. His story would fade into the background for centuries, only to roar back to life in times of great social change. His example claimed by rebels, artists, and thinkers who saw in him a kindred spirit. In the Roman Empire, even as Stoicism became the preferred philosophy of emperors and senators, the anecdotes about Diogenes were still widely told and enjoyed. He was the wild, untamable ancestor that the respectable Stoics both admired and were slightly embarrassed by. The former slave and great Stoic philosopher, Epictetus, spoke of the ideal Cynic path as a divine calling, a heroic but almost impossibly difficult road that required a special kind of strength. Even the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man in the world, reflected in his private meditations on the importance of parrhesia, the fearless, free speech that Diogenes had embodied. Diogenes served as a kind of moral conscience, a reminder of the radical, uncompromising route from which their own, more moderate philosophy had grown. During the long centuries of the European Middle Ages, Diogenes largely vanished from view. In a world dominated by Christian faith and feudal hierarchy, a pagan philosopher who preached shamelessness and mocked all authority was a deeply problematic figure. He was often remembered, if at all, as one of the foolish pagans, an eccentric figure from a benighted past. Yet, even here, a faint echo of his example could be found. The ideal of asceticism, of renouncing all worldly goods to live a life of poverty and principle, was central to some forms of Christian monasticism. The mendicant friars, who wandered the land with no possessions, surviving on charity, bore a superficial, if unintentional, resemblance to the Cynic lifestyle. They had traded Diogenes' devotion to nature and reason for a devotion to God, but the rejection of the material world was a shared impulse. It was in the Renaissance that Diogenes was truly reborn. As European thinkers rediscovered the lost texts of the classical world, they rediscovered its most defiant character. He became a hero for a new age of humanism, an era that celebrated the power and potential of the individual. Renaissance artists were fascinated by him. His theatrical confrontations with Plato and Alexander became popular subjects for paintings, capturing the dramatic clash between the individual and the establishment. This fascination deepened during the Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries. For philosophers who were challenging the absolute power of kings and the unquestioned dogma of the Church, Diogenes was a perfect symbol. Thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau saw in him a prototype of the natural man, a figure who lived a simple life, uncorrupted by the decadent artificialities of civilization. The French philosophes admired his use of satire and his fearless courage to speak truth to power. He was a man who had obeyed only the dictates of his own reason, the very ideal that the Enlightenment championed. As the world moved into the modern era of industrialization and mass society, Diogenes' relevance only grew. His rejection of materialism became a powerful critique of the new consumer culture. His independence became an inspiration for those who felt crushed by the conformity of modern life. Anarchists and early socialists saw him as one of their own, a man who had lived a life completely free from the control of the state and the illusions of private property. In the 20th century, he became a full-blown countercultural icon. For the beat poets of the 1950s, the hippies of the 1960s, and the punk rockers of the 1970s, Diogenes was a kindred spirit. He was the original dropout, the first punk, the ultimate nonconformist. His life was a testament to the idea of living your truth, of rejecting the rat race, and of finding freedom not in accumulating more, but in needing less. He was a performance artist who used his own body and his own life as his medium, a man who had declared war on hypocrisy centuries before it became fashionable. This is his enduring legacy. He is not a philosopher who left behind a complex system. He left no books, no grand theories. Instead, he left behind a series of powerful and indelible images. The image of a man living in a jar remains a permanent challenge to our obsession with homes and possessions. The image of a man holding a lamp in daylight is a timeless symbol of the search for honesty in a dark world. And the image of a beggar telling the conqueror of the world to stand out of his light is perhaps the most powerful icon of individual integrity in the face of overwhelming power that our civilization has ever produced. He is not a set of answers. He is a permanent and uncomfortable question. And so the question that Diogenes left behind, the uncomfortable question embodied by his entire life, continues to echo through the ages. But what does it ask of us now? What would happen if that same man, Diogenes the dog, were to appear today, walking not through the sunlit agora of Athens, but through the canyons of glass and steel that make up a modern city? What would he see in the light of his flickering lamp? He would see a world that has, in many ways, perfected the very hypocrisies he despised. He would see a civilization more obsessed with possessions than any ancient king, where people go into lifelong debt to acquire things they do not need, becoming willing slaves to the very objects they believe they own. He would look at the glowing screens that mesmerize billions, and he would see not a tool for connection, but a stage for the most elaborate performance of the self ever conceived. He would see people carefully curating digital masks, desperately chasing the approval of strangers in the form of likes and shares, a hunger for reputation that he would have recognized instantly. He would conclude that we have not banished shame, but have simply found more sophisticated ways to hide from it. He would listen to the endless noise of our world, the 24-hour news cycles, the constant stream of advertisements, the shouting matches of political debate, and he would see it as a grand distraction, a complex system designed to keep people from the difficult and terrifying task of looking inward. He would see a world drowning in information, but thirsting for wisdom. He would see us talking endlessly about freedom, while willingly imprisoning ourselves in habits of comfort and consumption. He would see a culture obsessed with the idea of authenticity, yet he would point out that we often try to buy it. We buy authentic brands, go on authentic travel experiences, and craft an authentic personal image. Diogenes would laugh at this. He knew that authenticity is not something you can add to your life. It is what is left over when you have had the courage to strip everything else away. His philosophy, for all its ancient strangeness, has never been more relevant. His methods are a direct challenge to the anxieties of the modern world. His practice of Askēsis, of voluntary hardship, is a powerful antidote to a culture that makes us soft and fragile. In an age of comfort, he teaches resilience. His ideal of Autarkeia, of radical self-sufficiency, is a call to find our self-worth within ourselves, not in our job titles, our bank accounts, or our online status. In an age of validation seeking, he teaches integrity. His commitment to Anaideia, to shamelessness, is a challenge to question the arbitrary social rules and inherited anxieties that govern our lives. In an age of conformity, he teaches us to question. And his greatest idea, cosmopolites, the citizen of the world, is a concept our deeply divided planet is still struggling to understand. He reminds us that the things that unite us as human beings are far more real and far more important than the flags, borders, and tribes that we use to tear ourselves apart. Ultimately, the figure of Diogenes does not offer us a comfortable set of answers. He did not leave behind a neat, 5-step program for happiness. His entire life was designed to do the opposite. He is a mirror. He is a challenge. He is the voice that whispers the questions we are too afraid to ask ourselves. And so, his search continues, not in the streets of Athens, but in the landscape of our own minds. His lamp is passed to us, and its light is turned inward. It illuminates the dark corners of our own lives and forces us to ask, are you living, or are you merely performing? Is the life you lead your own, or is it a collection of desires and ambitions that others have given to you? Are you truly free, or have you simply become comfortable in a more elaborate and well-decorated cage? What, in your world of endless complexity, is actually real? And if you were to begin a search today, in the bright, glaring daylight of your own life, could you find a man?